I'm the co-founder and CEO of runZero, which is an asset inventory company that I founded with my friend and former colleague and current colleague again, HD Moore, who's one of the creators of, or the creator of Metasploit. And but I got into security, God, long time ago. As long as I can think back, every time when I went into a bank, I looked at the security systems and like thought about like how would I rob this bank and how would I overcome these systems. So when your mind works like that, you have two paths in life. Either you go to jail or you go into security. So I think I picked the safe one, and so that was my interest to start with, and then I went to college. I studied politics actually, so nothing to do with computer science. But I saw a book in the library that kind of piqued my interest, and that was Bruce Schneier's Applied Cryptography. And so I read through that. I didn't understand the math, but I understood kind of like the vague concepts, because as a political science student, you don't do a lot of math. And then later I went to back to Germany and started working there in a startup that ultimately got acquired by PGP, Pretty Good Privacy. You might remember that back in the days. And so I'm very familiar with Alice and Bob, your good friends. Charlie sometimes dropped in. Eve, we didn't like that much, but yeah. So that was that time. And then I moved on, another crypto company, then to Rapid7, where I met HD, working on Metasploit. That was a completely different direction. The hackers have better parties than the cryptographers, better
statistically
stories.
speaking.
So, so that got me really interested. And then after that, I went on to Veracode, worked there for a while, and then co-founded runZero with HD. Yeah. The life plan was that I wanted to go into journalism, actually, and that was really interesting, like journalism or advertising, which is like a weird combination. I guess it's both about communicating with people, and convincing. Well, journalism less so convincing people; it's more straight up reporting, and advertising is more convincing people. And when I left the UK, I kind of thought, and I don't know if this was justified, but I thought, okay, in the UK, like my English, I didn't think was good enough at the time to really compete. The journalism schools are really competitive, so I thought I couldn't crack it on the language level. And if I went back to Germany, I'd lived outside of Germany for over 10 years at that point, and I hadn't closely followed local politics, and a lot of the entry exams are about politics, and it's really hard to get in there. So I kind of decided I didn't want to go down that route. Actually, never tried. Maybe I should have done that. But then I ended up in working in an ad agency as a graphic designer during the day, and for a software company that ultimately got sold to PGP as running marketing and a ton of other stuff. I think I was like the only person who wasn't coding, so it's like pretty much everything else. And then I learned a ton about security as well, and have been in security ever since.
I think one of the reasons we like having people like yourself on as a guest is you're a true hacker. You know, if you look through your blog and your Twitter feed, you have lots of interests. I've seen that you've made a hat. You've soldered some electronics together and made a hat that made sure you could point north. You've done things with rubber duckies, but then you've also done like technical market analysis, things with cryptography. With that kind of mindset and all those different interests, how do you decide, what's going to pique your interest? What's going to be your focus?
I always like to say that I'm trying to pick up all the different skills that you see in heist movies.
Excellent.
So I've done, like the one of the things that we're, I think, going to talk about a little bit later is social engineering. I've been that was a big interest of mine, and we can dive into that a little bit later, and all the OSINT side of that. I've had this fascination with pickpocketing for a while, and then my dad got pickpocketed next to me on a train in Paris, and I'm like, how do you do this? Like that was actually more interesting than how to prevent it. And so I decided that I would research that, and actually did a talk about it at Layer 8 conference. That's up on YouTube. So if you Google that, you can learn how to pickpocket. And I pickpocket people live on stage, which was an absurd experience because I literally practiced and researched for 6 months and then never did it again after that conference.
I mean,
but it was a ton of fun.
That's fantastic of turning that kind of situation and seeing it as a, family member being pickpocketed, thinking that's a learning opportunity for me to learn new skills. That's that really is the hacker mentality right there.
Yeah. Then one of my interests was also, I always wanted to kind of intern with a fortune teller to figure out how that works. And so there is a book I read by Ian Rowland, who it's, what is it called? I forgot. It's something about cold reading. I can probably send it over to you. You can put it in the show notes. But it's a book on how people make you believe that they are actually able to see the future, or have divine inspiration and all of that stuff. But it's of course all bogus. And so I learned some of these techniques, and then at a hackathon at Veracode, I tried those out on a few people, and then gave a talk about it at DEF CON. So that's also up on YouTube. And that was a ton of fun. There's a ton of interesting things that you can learn, not only for social engineers and for your general life, but also how to apply it to sales. I wrote a few articles on Medium about that. So it's always kind of like where my interests kind of take me. On my short list is to learn how to read lips. I think that would be really interesting. That's I gotta have like some sabbatical or a TV with broken speakers or something like that before I can.
So if we see you walking down the streets with noise cancelling headphones on, this is just practice.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit more then about your journey into social engineering, and then we can maybe come back to some of the ways you can apply social engineering in everyday life, like you've mentioned in your blog. So how did you start getting professionally into social engineering?
Professionally, well, as a marketer. I think marketing is it's understanding your audience and then crafting a message that makes sense from their perspective, right? And it doesn't always mean lying. And I actually think that social engineering to me is a set of techniques that you can apply in good and bad situations. So I'll give you an example. When you apply social engineering, let's say in people management, right? Is that a bad thing? Is that really an unethical thing? I don't think so, and here's why. Let's say you had two managers. One of them has read the official manual on how to best communicate with people, and the other one hasn't, right? So who do you think is going to be the better manager? I think it's going to be the one who understands people and how they work. Now, the question is, how do you apply that? If you apply it to have the optimal outcome for everybody and move a situation forward, then I think it's a very positive thing. If you use it to manipulate people and do things under false pretenses, then I think it's a bad thing. Oh, good question. Yeah. Influence. Yeah. I think deception is often when you either bring in false facts. They're not facts if they're false, I guess. And when you really distort the truth. I think influence is sometimes it's a framing. Is I'm trying to find a good example for framing. One thing that I learned in political theory was the concept of a thruffer, which is the combination of a threat and an offer. And it's not quite that, but I think it kind of illustrates the point a little bit. It's basically when you state a fact to somebody or have a conversation with somebody, it could either be perceived as a threat or an offer, depending on the expectation of the recipient. So if I tell you, Karl, if you finish this project, you can keep the job, right? Does that mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you were expecting to get fired and you're getting a second chance, it's a good thing. If you were expecting to keep the job, it's not a good thing, right? And so, so the recipient's mindset matters, but then also when you frame something, let me think about framing. It's often done in sales. So, for example, you're buying a car, and the cost of the GPS. You know, I was buying a car, and I'm cheap, so I'm like, you have a, you know, like they were trying to sell me the car on the lot that had a GPS, and it was $2,500 more expensive. And I thought, well, it's a bad GPS compared to Google Maps, and I can just use my phone and have it for free, right? So to me, it was $2,500, and so to me, it was an unnecessary expense. The seller tried to sell it to me as like, oh, it's only $32 a month, so it's not all that much compared to like a whatever $30,000 car or whatever it was. And so that's a little bit framing and so on. And of course, he was trying to frame it in a way that would make the expense smaller and make me move on that purchase and make that decision. And I was thinking about, you know, my wallet. So your original question was about influence and deception, right? So if we're thinking about that, I think everybody's influence can be a positive thing when you're talking to your partner at home and you're saying, hey, what do you think about going to this and this restaurant? You really like the pasta there, and so on. That's trying to influence. She might like the pasta there. She might not. Well, she probably likes the pasta if you're suggesting that and if you're framing it that way. And that's influencing, but it's not really deception. You know, deception would be if, I don't know, you knew they were out of pasta or something. I don't know. Right.
Yeah, and it's very much down to context, isn't it? Because in some situations it can be gaslighting, can't it? Like telling someone something that isn't true. So it's very interesting, isn't it?
I think it's the intent. It's a little bit like lockpicking. Is lockpicking unethical, illegal? It really depends on the context. Do you have permission of the owner of the lock to pick it? If so, then it's fine. It's ethical, right? If you don't, then it's probably not ethical. Mm, mm, mm. But yes, but then you've got to, I mean, they're making sense of something. You know, what is the truth is actually in the eye of the beholder, right? So you're already implying your own value judgment in what makes sense. So, right? This is getting a lot more philosophical than I expected. Yeah, to some extent, right? To some extent. So this is probably like a good time to talk about the social engineering competition that I participated in, right? So at DEF CON, there is a village, used to be called the Social Engineering Village. Now they changed names. It's the SE Community Village, where contestants can go up on stage and phone a company for 20, 30 minutes in front of a live audience, and they need to try and extract certain pieces of information. It's like 20, 30 pieces of information. I forgot what the exact count is. And you might listen to that and you think like, oh, they're really, thinking on their feet and doing it on the fly. When I did it, so before you go up on stage, what most people don't know at this conference is you actually get the name of your target company a few weeks ahead of time. And then you start a process of writing a very detailed report. So these reports are between 40 and 120 pages per company, where you really go down and you try to find all of these flags in OSINT sources and online sources. So for those not familiar with that term, OSINT, it's open source intelligence, which basically means like, think of it as fancy Googling, like Googling with intent, right? You're trying to figure out a specific piece of information from the vast sea of information that's out there on the internet. And sometimes it's a simple Google query. Sometimes you need to go down several steps. So in OSINT we call these pivot points, right? Where, for example, I'm on the jury of this year's SE Community Village, and I'm grading the reports right now. So, for example, one of the questions is, who's doing the janitorial service? Who's picking up the trash? When is trash pickup day? All of these things. So sometimes you can't just Google, Acme company janitorial services, because maybe the janitorial service is provided by the building. So I've seen some people first look up, okay, who's the landlord of that office building? Do they provide the janitorial services? And then who contracts with them as janitorial services, right? Or for trash pickup, they use Google Street View to figure out what's the brand on the dumpster outside. And then they go to the, let's say, wastemanagement.com website, and they say, for this zip code, when is pickup? Right? So it's not just a simple query. It's not like, sometimes you just need to think through the different steps of like, okay, how would I get this information? Like, what are the relationships between the different parties, and where might that information be?
I think that, the point you made earlier about wanting to be in a heist movie and wanting to learn all the techniques, these are often the things that when you see the movie and, a bad movie, someone just walks in and charms the receptionist and walks straight through into the building. But the better movies in reality...
There are people who can do that. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Jason, Jason Street, who you had on the podcast a few weeks ago, he actually is somebody who spends as little as possible on OSINT and focuses on just being in the moment and reacting. I'm a prepper. I I will prep for anything I can. And so I went super deep. Like, my OSINT report, my call scripts were super detailed. But then you also have to think on your feet. So if something deviates from the script, and this was actually after the competition, I started doing improv classes, because those help you kind of really think on your feet, justify anything that's thrown at you, and those kind of things. One situation was I was calling that year we were targeting gaming and toy companies. And the company that was my target was a Fortune 500 companies that makes children's toys, like physical toys mostly. And so I called up one of their retail locations, right? Called up one of their retail locations and went through my script. And I was talking about, something with their POS systems. And the guy on the phone told me like, oh, does that have anything to do with like the issue we had with the credit cards a few weeks ago, and so on? And this was like, and I thought, like, in these calls, you have to number one, you have to manage your time really well, and number two, it's dangerous if you get them to disclose things that are confidential. So there is like a fine line of when you're starting to break the law. So I really didn't want to go there. So I had to think on my feet on like getting the situation back on track to the stuff that I wanted to talk about. So those are kind of things where you need to think on your feet. And sometimes you asked me like before we started the recording, like moments when I failed, like the year before I won the competition, I had a really good OSINT report, but I got 0 points on the calls. And that was for a number of reasons. It was Saturday, and this is like a B2B company, and like they didn't have any good numbers. And I was trying to hit cell phones of individual people. And one person I was trying to target was a facility manager, because I knew they'd broken ground on a new facility, and I'd found their tenant agreement because it was filed with the SEC. It was like a material expenditure or whatever. So I had the full tenant agreement. I knew when their lease was running out, and I was pretending to be from the company leasing out the old place and saying, "Oh, we've got some new tenants who want to view the place." And so I phoned up this person, and they basically said, "Hey, I'm in New York right now, about to walk into a Broadway show. And I don't even know why you're calling me. We just extended the lease 3 weeks ago." And so I was, it's kind of hard to think on your feet. Like, how do you pivot away from that? Like, how do you keep the person on the phone, not going into the Broadway show? And how do you pivot your pretext to still be relevant? So I, I just gave up at that point and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, like I have, need to talk to my manager, etc." And I hung up. But yeah, I've seen some people do really amazing things. What I respect the most is when the target is actually suspicious about the call, and they stick to the, stay in character, stick to the script, and actually turn it around and then get them to disclose more flags. I think that's really good skill to kind of like talk somebody off a ledge, build rapport again, make them forget that they had doubts, and have them leak more
I
information.
think one of the best examples I've heard of that was actually I think it was the call to the Russian team who'd allegedly poisoned Alex Navalny. And so they were calling up a Russian agent and trying to engineer them into revealing information. Of course, they're instantly suspicious. And what they did was they upped the pressure on him and started, look, I've got a report to write, I've got deadlines, you're going to get in trouble if you don't tell me these things. And I was just fascinated to see how he started off in a deeply suspicious place, but quickly started yielding information when the pressure was piled on.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've learned is start out with easy questions, things that don't raise alarms. And it's a little bit like salami tactic, like you go bit by bit by bit. And the more slices you have, the more they're in, we all have a tendency to stick to the things we've said before, right? So if for example, you recommend this brand of microphone like publicly and to all of your friends, and then you think, actually they've gotten a bit worse and they're not that great anymore or whatever, like you actually have, it's going to be harder for you to admit that and to change course than if you hadn't ever said anything about it. Yeah. Yeah. Or also when you design surveys, you have to be careful that that the default answer you're expecting is not always yes. So it's kind of like called straight lining. People kind of fall into this pattern of answering the same thing again. So you want to like flip the question around. So sometimes it's no, sometimes it's yes for a certain outcome and so on. And so when you're calling somebody on the phone, start out with really small questions and asks, and then increase the asks. And the reason I'm aligning that with like straight lining and continuing on your behavior is because if they think answering the previous question or the previous 10 questions was okay, why do they suddenly think that the 11th question is not okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. 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 So if you're asking yourself the question about the 11th question, then you also got to ask the same question about were the previous 10 okay? And most people are like, but I answered those. So if I don't think they were okay, then I made a mistake and I didn't want to make a mistake. So it's kind of like that cognitive dissonance, I think is what it's called. throwing words out there that
Is it similar in
Sorry?
marketing where you want to buy a product, so you avoid the bad reviews, you focus on the thing because you feel like you've already gone down a path?
Yeah, that's more confirmation bias. So where you only see the things that align with your expectations. So that would be.
But do you get to define those expectations by asking the question, so you've kind of set the thing going in a certain direction?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different. I would say confirmation bias, the way you could use that. I know there's a lot of female social engineers. Some of them are extremely technical, and they always play into the stereotype that women don't understand technology. So by saying like, oh, like I really don't know how this works. Could you help me? I've got this. I can't figure out how to print out this resume. It's on this USB stick. Could you print that out for me? Those kind of things. They're playing into biases in the recipient to get them to take a certain action. Yeah. Yeah. Social proof is really interesting. I mean, you use it a lot in marketing, like all the testimonials and reference marketing is all social proof, right? But I also think there's really interesting techniques in how you use that in social engineering. And I actually would love to give a talk on that one day, because I do think that trust is something that's not really well understood like humans don't understand trust very well. So it starts with the fact that most people think that trust is always bidirectional. Karl, you and I trust each other, right? But trust is actually directional. I trust you and you trust me. And those can be true at the same time, but they can also be, one trusting the other, but not the other way around, right? So that's one thing to kind of get into your mind. Just because somebody else trusts me doesn't mean I need to trust them. And con artists will actually use that, where they say, hey, I know I've only just met you, but could you watch my laptop while I go to the bathroom, right? So they go to the bathroom, they come back, and then the other person feels that they trust each other, but it's only the con artist who supposedly trusts the mark and not the other way around, right? And so that's one way to build trust, but it's built on a fallacy. Second thing is, I've seen trust being exploited in two-step kind of situations. And I remember I've seen this many times, but the best example that stuck in my mind is one from a talk. I think it was Tinkersek who had it in a talk, where he basically said he went into a building and looked for, I don't know, an old lady who was clearly not part of IT. Like he looked for somebody who's definitely not IT, and kind of like got the vibe from this person that he thought she's not IT. And then he said, hi, I'm with XYZ company. I need to do some repairs on the server room. Could you please show me where the IT help desk is? Right? And of course, because she was a nice lady, she walked him over to the IT desk and told the man, this man is with XYZ company. He needs to make some repairs on the server room. Could you please let him into the server room? Right? So, and I thought, oh, this is actually really interesting, because this brings me back to my days working for PGP. Because PGP, like when we think about encryption systems today with a PKI, it's all very hierarchical. It's all like top down. You have a certificate authority that issues certificate, and sometimes there's like multi-levels with sub-CAs and so on. But the original model with PGP was more chaotic and more like how we look at trust relationships in society, where Karl, I can sign, like, I have a key that I generate, you have a key that you generate, and then James also generates a key. And now how do I know which key to actually trust if I want to send an encrypted email to? Do I know it's Karl's key or James's key? It's really hard to figure out. So what you did is, if, like, let's say I meet Karl in person, I understand he's Karl and this is his key. I can take my key and sign your key. It's called the web of trust, right? I sign your key and I say, this key is Karl's key and I vouch for that. But there is a second parameter I can set. And that is, do I trust Karl to introduce other keys to me that I trust? Concept of transitive trust, right? And so let's say I met with Vladimir Putin. Maybe I trust him that he's him and that this is his key, and I sign it for that. But I would never trust him to tell me that another person's key is their key, right? And so if we're thinking back to the example with the old lady, the help desk person trusted that the lady was the lady because he's seen her a million times at her desk, but she shouldn't have trusted the information that she was bringing to him, right? So those are just really interesting. To me, those are really interesting concepts because you can abstract it and then you can think about, okay, how can I use that in an engagement? Maybe I find some information online, and how can I use that information to create these kind of transitive trust relationships? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, we're still,
that is the
super philosophical.
Yeah, but that's the really interesting part.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. So there are a few reasons. So janitorial services is maybe a little bit easier to explain. If I know who's doing the janitorial service, I can look up what the uniforms look like, throw on a uniform, walk into the building, right? So it gets me past the security desk. If it was like a longer operation, I could, maybe even apply with that company and get in, those kind of things. But for most, paid social engineering engagements, you wouldn't go to that length. Most of the time, you just go to the area where people smoke and you tailgate in. It's often as easy as that. But then once you're in the building, now you can put, some people call it a Dropbox. You put a Dropbox on the network. It's a little computer that you plug into the local network, and maybe it has a 5G card, so that phone's home, and now you have a presence inside that network, and you can hack that network from the inside without having to go through the firewalls and all the protections from the outside, right? Then you get out so that you limit your time inside the building. If we think about waste pickup, it's more interesting, I think, for shredding services than for waste, because nowadays it's information is usually important information is usually put in the shredder bin. But if you know when they're getting picked up, then you have two pieces of information. Number one, when is it the fullest, right? And number two, if you get in a few hours before the real pickup, you can probably pick up those boxes and put some new ones in, and you know that everything that's in that box is probably interesting, right? So those are things where you could use OSINT for physical engagements. And then there's also a lot of information that you could use for digital engagements or like network attacks. So, for example, if you know what operating system somebody's using, the browser and the antivirus solution that's in play, now you can build a phishing attack with a virus or piece of malware that is obfuscated enough to get past these defenses and targets those specific systems, right? Because you can, like, typically when you craft a piece of malware, you can test it in a lab and see if it number one, does it evade the antivirus? And number two, does it work on that browser and operating system? Depending on, like, there's different attack vectors, but the more you know about the systems, the better it is. And grading some of the papers has been interesting because I knew how I got some of those pieces of information, but actually I'm keeping score a little bit, and I'll probably publish that after we're done with the exercise. It's actually surprising that the same type of information is often found with a similar type of methods. So operating system, two ways. Most people actually find it on YouTube, which you probably wouldn't expect. Because it's either an office tour where you see somebody on a screen and you can just look at the taskbar, or it's a webcast that some of the people in the company hold, and you can look at the taskbar and all the surrounding things, right? At the browser that they're using to share something, etc. LinkedIn is also really good, especially for the antivirus. Like if the antivirus isn't in the taskbar on a YouTube video, for example, you can often find that by looking, you might do in URL : linkedin.com/in, which gives you all of the public LinkedIn profiles. And then you just search, either you can just give the company name and antivirus. But what I like to do is, because somebody might just say CrowdStrike on their profile and not CrowdStrike antivirus, right? So you wouldn't find it. But I look at listings of the most common systems, most common phone systems, most common antivirus systems. And oftentimes I use like the Gartner Magic Quadrant. I just look at the top right quadrant. That's going to be the majority of deployments. So if I just plug in those keywords in my search, I usually get a hit. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
And
Those are super, super helpful.
The certifications as well, I quite often see those popping up on LinkedIn where some, suddenly the whole IT team's shouting, hey, we've now got trained in this tool as part of a migration. And you're like, oh, okay, that's really interesting information there. So, absolutely. So
the craziest OSINT report I ever saw was not one that I wrote myself, but it was a contestant a few years back. And she found somebody where somebody posted on Instagram. They were actually not working for the company directly as an employee, but they were a contractor. And they were posting on Instagram all of these pictures, and it was it was like she had 12 pages on this guy. And it started out with a picture like, oh, new job, and here's my desk. And it showed like, his computer and the window and the parking lot behind it, and the blind that was like rolled half down, which had a picture of the full networking diagram on it. So that was a good find. Then a few snaps of his screens that revealed like some applications he was using, like email client is very helpful, because if you're trying to get through spam filters and some phishing protections and so on, testing with that same mail client helps. And then even he was hugging a firewall, a new firewall he'd gotten on one of the pictures with a model number and everything. It just went on. Like even like his car with a license plate, where he was stationed in the Navy. He even had credit cards that he'd just gotten that he was really proud of. He'd blurred out the numbers. Because, right? So he was somewhat security aware, but there was a ton more information that you could glean from that. So yeah, it was just it was mind-boggling. Are you saying, am I being targeted, or do I find some? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, I I haven't seen that. I am getting some LinkedIn requests from accounts that just don't look right. and I just ignore those. Typically, it's something where the resume just doesn't align. It might be, I don't know. It's hard to explain, but sometimes you look at a resume and you have to, like, you've seen thousands of legit resumes, and you look at this one and you think, like, that's a little odd. It just doesn't feel right. Like, the countries and jobs and education and all of that don't line up, and so I just ignore those. But I think those are probably more attempts for cold calls and like telemarketing and so on than they are actually like intelligence operations or something like that. I would hope that they're a little smarter.
So you do all the open source research there. You can go out, you can, like you say, advanced Googling, you can find lots of information online on LinkedIn, which is all perfectly fine because it's in the public domain. You can go and search that. But then things get a bit more complicated towards the end of the social engineering challenges when it crosses over to dealing with real humans calling people up. So there must be a lot of rules and regulations around this, and there must be challenges if you get collateral damage of people who didn't know they're involved in this revealing information. So how does that get handled?
So I only know that firsthand from the competitions. No, it's secondhand from like engagements from other people. But in the competition, the company does not consent, right? The target company does not consent. So you have to be very careful to stick to certain classes of information. So those are, for example, it's fine to ask for operating system, VPN, browser, janitorial service, like all of those things, but you can't ask for passwords, social security numbers, credit card numbers, anything that would be considered PII about the person, And so those rules are clearly laid out to the contestants, and the judges and the folks in the room that operate the tech. Like, if a target reveals like a phone number, for example, unprompted, or any information, they just turn down the volume so that the room can't hear. The caller can still hear it, but the room can't hear it, right? So you're limiting exposure. And also, if you can imagine, like in a room like, like with 500 or 1,000 people at DEF CON, if somebody reads out a phone number out loud on stage, you can be sure that at least 5 people in the room start dialing that number. Right? That would kind of be a negative outcome.
Have you ever come across a person, complaining that they've been socially engineered by one of these competitions?
No, never heard that. No, never heard that.
So you're doing quite well at the operational cover-up afterwards.
I've talked to people who work at companies that have been a target, and I actually did read the report and knew about the whole thing, and kind of had to maintain confidentiality and not tell anything. But yeah, they were, they thought it was all above board and all a good thing, and yeah. So I've never heard of real blowback from any companies. Yeah, exactly. I think it goes back to our conversation earlier, right? The intent is not to harm these companies. The intent is to provide more awareness around social engineering, and to provide a way for the community to learn about how social engineering works. I'd read a ton of books. Kevin Mitnick was one of the authors I read a ton about, and I always got like, oh, this is really interesting, and I wanted to learn more and so on. But it never really clicked for me until I was in the room in the SE Community Village at DEF CON, where they actually had somebody on the phone and it worked, and I could experience that live. That's when it clicked for me. So I think there is a real learning opportunity for the community, and it's just, it's just super fun and interesting, and you see what kind of things work and don't work, and when people fall down. Like, one thing that I find painful is when the social engineer actually has a live person on the line, and they're kind of like, they're talking around the topic, but they're not making the ask. And so I think when you have to make the ask to actually get the piece of information. It takes too long if you're just skirting around the issue. And talking about like, oh, like, your office is clean, and then you're waiting for them to disclose the janitorial company. That doesn't really work. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really hard. So I never blame anybody who gets social engineered, right? It can happen to anybody, and I've seen social engineers who are very good at what they do who've been social engineered. It does happen. So for companies, let's talk. I think we've got to talk about it separately for companies and for individuals. For companies, it helps to know what kind of information is out there and what kind of information is available. Um, One of the recommendations I often read in the OSINT reports is like, oh, you should ask Google to blur your dumpster logo or something like that. And I'm thinking like, is that really the best way? Because you could drive, like, first of all, you're never going to keep up with that. Secondly, somebody could just drive by and snap a picture or just take notes. Like that doesn't really get to the heart of the problem. I think it's more important to have very clear processes on, for example, how to authenticate somebody over the phone using non-public information. And you'd be surprised because even businesses like the big credit bureaus are terrible at this, because they ask you a lot of knowledge-based questions about like, oh, what was your first car and where did you have this mortgage and what street did you live on, that are all more or less Googleable. And so these are not good pieces of information to authenticate somebody. So those need to be excluded in the processes, and you need to have a clean process of what are the ways that you can authenticate somebody. What is a safe path? And I think that helps a ton. So having good processes and training people to stick to those processes. Oh my God, yeah. I mean, if you have talked to anybody who's a pen tester or in a bug bounty, like the first step of a pen test is recon, right? And some of that can be OSINT, where you take information that's already out there, and some of it can be active scanning. So some people use Nmap, some people use like runZero, like our product and so on for that. But or a DNS dumpster, well, I guess that's OSINT, right? Because it's already scanned, it's already ingested, so you're not making an active outreach um, to the target. But just looking at subdomains, for example, you can tell a ton of what infrastructure a company has, and it's so hard to hide. If you type in any company name .okta.com, you see if they're using Okta because you're getting to their SSO sign-on page, right? So I think you're leaking a lot of that information, and it's actually very hard uh, to hide that. I think you can do those kind of discoveries yourself, do recon on yourself, do OSINT on yourself, clean up some of the most egregious things. But ultimately, you have to live with the fact that some of that is out there and can be leveraged against you. And then you need the processes to protect that information being leveraged against you. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think for a pen tester, it doesn't matter that much. For things like a competition where you have rules of what information is acceptable and not, it's you need to think about it a little bit more closely. The way I think about it is, for example, if you take Showdown or Census, they've already scanned the target. So you're not initiating the scan, the information's already there. So that I would see as OSINT. Whereas if you use the tool that actively scans like an Nmap, then that would not be OSINT, that would be active reconnaissance because you're connecting to the target. The question though is, what if you go to the company website, right? that feels like it's information that's out there, but at the same time you're interacting with the target. So it's a really fine line. And then if you right click and say view source to get to some of the maybe you want to see what JavaScript snippets they're using or something like that. Is that, I think that's still OSINT because it's kind of out there and expected interaction kind of thing. But it gets really tricky. Gets really tricky. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. My God. There's so much education that needs to happen. It was actually very interesting. I was at Rapid7 at a time when HD, my current co-founder, started Project Sonar. And so that was a project where he was scanning the entire internet, I think several times a day. And he got thousands of complaint letters, right? And so Rapid7 actually spun up a policy function. Think of it as lobbying, but not lobbying like for the company and for to get more dollars out of government budgets, but policy changes to change laws so that security researchers don't go to jail for bad reasons, right? And so the reason why a census and a showdown and so on can scan the world today and be relatively unhindered from that is because companies like Rapid7 and others went out and educated the lawmakers and the Secret Service and the FBI and the attorneys general and all of that, so that they understand why security researchers are doing that, and that the world would be a much worse place if they didn't do it, right? So when you think about just a straight up scan, like most people would say today that just scanning a system without trying to brute force passwords or increment like a number or something like that is fair game, and that's just connecting to systems, and that's okay. And then like crossing the line is when you're trying to use default passwords or breach credentials or something like that, or exploitation, right? Of course. But now you also have to think about, okay, what is a security researcher, like how should we treat a security researcher who's found a vulnerability? Maybe they saw something, they thought like, oh, this looks very exploitable, let me try that out. And then they report it to the company totally in good faith. Should they be prosecuted for that? Ethically, I think no, because they were acting in good faith. But like, how do you, as an attorney general, draw that line? Like, how do you make that distinction, or how do you codify that into law? It's actually a really interesting question, and what passes the test of, yes, this person was acting in good faith, right? Did they, if they just sent an email, did they tell a friend, or like I don't know, like it gets a little bit murky. I think there is probably an answer out there and individual judgment calls that need to be made in a court of law, but that doesn't give a lot of certainty to the individual security researchers that are trying to figure something out, right? Then it's better for you to shut up than to actually disclose it if you're at risk.
It comes back as well to that discussion we were having right at the start around what's deception and what's fair influence. These tools can be used in so many different ways, and it's often the intent of the person who's at the keyboard. Did they intend to accidentally take something out by scanning it aggressively or something along those lines? And even ownership of these things. I think there's an 80-year-old lady somewhere in the center of the US who gets vast numbers of complaints because there's an IP geo service that if they don't know where it is, they put a pin on the map near her house. So everyone writes to her complaining about spam emails that she's sending, and she doesn't even use a computer. So, we can end up in these things where it's falsely attributed as well.
Yeah.
Just as we're wrapping it up, because we're about to run out of time here, if there was one myth that you could debunk in cybersecurity, what would it be?
Oh, dear. Talk about broad questions, right? Only one? I think it's a really old one, and I'm talking about debunking with the general population. I think awareness is better in the InfoSec community, but in the general population, I think hackers are still seen as something bad, right? And so helping the public understand the hacker mindset of testing whether something is actually secure, etc. Basically what DEF CON's been trying to do for years. Educating the public about that. I think that would be something that I'd like to see more of, because there's still a lot of misunderstanding in the general non-IT, non-InfoSec public. Yes. That's actually another topic that I've dabbled in, because this was part of the pickpocketing stuff. When I was researching the pickpocketing techniques and those kind of things, there's two types of pickpockets. One is like the street pickpockets, and one is the stage pickpockets. And the stage pickpockets are often magicians, and all of the literature that you can get and all of the videos and so on are in magic shops, online and offline. So I went down that rabbit hole, and I think there is a lot of information, a lot of techniques that are actually at an abstract level, parallels between, let's say, social engineering or even IT security and magic, which is why I think there's actually a surprising amount of magic nerds in InfoSec. So think of, for example, there is one, I'll call it magic device or whatever, which is called a double backer. Like in card magic, you can have a card that has two backs, right? And so when you're playing with people's expectations that if one side is the back, the other one is the front, right? And so, and based on that, you can then put together certain tricks and routines that create a magic effect. If you're thinking about how to use that in social engineering, for example, let's say you are going into a building and they're wearing badges with photos on one side. The back of that is blank. So if you just put a completely blank badge on your zip kind of belt holder or your lanyard, then people might assume that they're just seeing the back of the card and not think anything of it, right? So I think you can apply those kind of concepts from magic to social engineering and vice versa. Or I think there is a ton of examples like that.
Sorry if we've ruined magic there for any listeners.
May I just, if people want to reach out to me, they can find me on Twitter. I'm Chris_Kirsch on Twitter. Also Chris Kirsch on LinkedIn, pretty easy to find. Company website is runZero.com. And if you want to check out the trial there to scan your network to see what's connected and do an asset inventory, that would be fantastic. I would be really happy about that.